Thunder crawled across the hills of Thunder Ridge, flattening the grass into rivers of light. The storm had broken the sky open, and the sanctuary trembled beneath it. 9 crates shook against the mud, each holding a sound that didn't belong to captivity, the cries of orphaned wild things. At the fence line stood an old bobcat, motionless beneath the downpour, his fur slick, his eyes molten gold. He had no claws, no freedom, nothing but the patience of years. Staff murmured from behind glass, uncertain, afraid of instinct reborn. Yet the animal didn't lunge. He simply breathed, slow and deliberate, as if testing whether the world still deserved gentleness. Inside the chaos, the storm paused. The wild seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if something once broken could remember how to protect. The smallest kitten stumbled through the mud, too young to understand fear, too desperate to obey it. Its paws pressed against the fence where the old cat waited, the metal vibrating between 2 lost worlds. He lowered his head, every scar visible beneath wet fur, and released a low, ancient note, half growl, half heartbeat. It traveled through rain and wire into the trembling ribs of the orphan. The crying stopped. One by one, the others followed, curling near the fence line, eyes wide, watching the motionless figure who commanded calm without claws. The thunder moved east. The wind thinned. In a place built from human mistakes, silence returned like grace. And for the first time in years, the old cat did not look like a prisoner. He looked like the center of the storm, learning how to stay still.
Morning found the ground steaming, the scent of rain tangled with fur. The kittens slept in a line pressed against the wire, tiny bodies drumming to a rhythm set by the heavy breath beyond it. Rowan hadn't moved all night, his eyes half closed, his chest rising slow as tide. Grace Porter stood in the mist, clipboard forgotten at her side, unwilling to disturb the pattern. Cameras blinked red from the corners of the enclosure, collecting proof of something that didn't need evidence. Nature, it seemed, had rewritten its rulebook overnight. The orphans, born from loss, had attached their survival to a ghost of the wild, and the ghost, stripped of claws and pride, had chosen to answer. When the morning sun slid through the trees, it found the mesh glowing, not as barrier, but as bridge. By noon, the rhythm between cages had become ritual. The kittens watched the old male before touching their food, mirroring his stillness, copying his grace. Even the smallest gestures, a blink, a stretch, a turn of the head, became commands. From her station, Grace noted the pattern, the synchronicity forming like choreography. Dr. Lang called it behavioral mimicry. Grace thought otherwise. This wasn't imitation, it was remembering. Each movement felt inherited, like instinct passed through observation rather than blood. The fence, once meant to divide predator and prey, now conducted a language older than sound. The orphans learned restraint, and the teacher, the mutilated remnant of wildness, learned relevance. Beyond the fence, the hills shimmered from storm runoff, each puddle reflecting the same image, one body teaching 9 how to be wild again.
At dusk, thunder returned in distant murmurs. The kittens shivered, unsteady, uncertain of safety. Inside the larger pen, Rowan rose stiffly. He pressed his damaged paws against the ground, each step deliberate, weighted with memory. He lay near the dividing fence and began to purr, not soft, not soothing, but deep enough to vibrate through the metal. The sound traveled like a current, shaking water droplets loose from leaves. The smallest kitten, Echo, lifted her head. Her breathing slowed until it matched his rhythm. In the control shed, lights flickered. The monitors showed movement without threat, power without violence. For the first time since the storm began, Grace turned away from the screen. She didn't need proof. Outside, the rain slowed, and the sanctuary pulsed with something more powerful than science, the steady beat of survival reborn. Night bled across the sanctuary, black and silver. Cameras watched but dared not blink. Rowan remained a shadow stitched to the fence line, his outline barely distinguishable from the terrain. On the other side, the 9 kittens moved as one body, mirroring his stillness, his patience. In that silence, the world seemed balanced on breath alone. Grace stood at the edge of the light spill, arms folded, knowing she was intruding on something sacred. There was no growling, no play, only a calm discipline no training could produce. Lightning flashed once, and for a split second, his eyes reflected something older, a flicker of another cage, another lifetime. The flash faded, but the image stayed. The scarred animal who could never return to the wild had become its keeper, teaching the next generation through the memory of pain.
The next morning arrived colorless, wind brushing dew into moving silver. Grace's coffee went cold as she watched the live feed. The kittens weren't playing anymore. They were mimicking precision. When Rowan shifted, they froze. When he rested, they did too. It was discipline without command. Lang's voice, recorded through intercom logs, used words like curiosity, conditioning, mirror neurons. But the footage disagreed. It looked less like science, more like reverence. Across the compound, the staff lowered their voices when they passed the enclosure, as if entering a chapel. The old cat lay under the oak, scars hidden beneath light, breathing like an unbroken tide. The young followed that rhythm because nature had chosen a strange teacher, one that had lost everything but will. And will, even in captivity, was still wild. Sometime near midnight, rain returned. Grace sat inside the observation shed, windows fogged, monitors blinking with static. The enclosure lights caught movement. The kittens pressed close to the fence, Rowan mirroring them on the other side. His body trembled from cold or memory. It was hard to tell which. Cameras flickered, capturing fragments. A paw raised, a head bowed, 9 small forms watching him breathe. Each flash of lightning built another image, layering present over past. A trailer, a cage, a younger version of this same animal folded into itself. The flash passed, the ghosts vanished, and only the storm remained. Grace realized the pattern wasn't new, it was continuation. The wild had been interrupted once, now it was rehearsing its return. Rowan wasn't reclaiming instinct, he was remembering it for those who still could.
The trailer memory lingers like a scar in the film grain. Metal, rust, and the smell of bleach haunt the silence. The younger version of the same bobcat curls into a cage too small for turning. Declawed, neutered, defeated. He watches Boots move outside his bars. The world that captured him never apologized. It only studied him. But in those dull amber eyes, something refused extinction. That same spark, small as breath, bright as defiance, carried him through 14 years and 1,000 days of waiting. The footage feels borrowed from another world, but it isn't. It's the same one. Only now, the creature who once begged for release has become the one who teaches others to run. Pain, reshaped by time, had chosen to mentor freedom. Back in the present, the sanctuary breathes differently. Morning drapes across wet grass, and the 9 kittens stretch in perfect sequence, their movements echoing the rhythm of the old bobcat behind the fence. Grace stands silent, knowing she is watching the impossible turn ordinary. There is no aggression, no confusion, just repetition, the kind that evolution carves when it finds something worth keeping. Rowan's fur, grayed with age, glows faintly where sunlight filters through the wire. He blinks once toward Grace's shadow in the glass, then returns to stillness. Between human ruin and animal resilience, something wordless thrives. The fence, the rules, the past, all of it dissolves into that single shared silence. Nature, it seems, has found a new way to speak, and it shows its messenger well.
Years earlier, the sound of boots against gravel replaced the hum of the storm. A decaying trailer sagged beneath a sky the color of ash. Inside, the air was thick with ammonia and fear. A cage no larger than a suitcase held a young bobcat with eyes too bright for that darkness. He did not snarl, he simply existed, small and folded in on himself. The smell of bleach, rust, and waste filled the room. Light from a flashlight sliced across fur matted with infection, paws swollen where claws should be. This was the beginning of his silence, the first lesson in stillness taught by pain. When the door opened and fresh air touched his face, he didn't move. Freedom, when you've forgotten its shape, can look like another kind of trap. In the examination room, bright lights stripped away mystery. X-rays showed bone ends shattered where claws had been ripped away. A voice somewhere said he'd never hunt, never fight, never mate. Words stacked like verdicts, heavy and certain. He blinked through the noise, watching reflections on stainless steel. Somewhere nearby, paper rustled, pens scratched, and human logic built its walls around him. But beneath the ache of sedatives and antiseptic, something older remained awake. Not anger, not defiance, just the raw instinct of a creature who refuses to disappear. He didn't understand rescue or diagnosis. He only knew that breathing still worked. And so he did, one slow inhale after another, the first act of resistance from a body that the world had already decided was finished.
The decision came quietly. The broken bobcat would stay. Construction began in the far corner of the sanctuary, where wild grass still grew in patches untouched by machines. Workers hammered and dug, their sweat turning soil into mud. Trees were planted not for beauty, but for belonging. A stream was carved to mimic what he'd never walk beside again. The fence rose, silver and exact, dividing safety from memory. When it was done, the enclosure gleamed like an apology built too late. They opened his crate at dawn. He stepped out, stiff, unsteady, ears flat against air that smelled like trees. His first steps weren't toward freedom, only toward distance from human hands. Even in captivity, the wild has its own geometry, a way of arranging itself around loss until it feels like space again. Days blurred into the rhythm of care. Food arrived twice, water replaced, logs filled with numbers. But the creature they now called Rowan didn't respond. He kept to the back corner, blending into shadow. His breathing was shallow, steady, detached. At night, when the lights went out, he paced. Every step measured, every pause identical, as if mapping a world he couldn't see. The fence was both horizon and limit, a line he traced like a prayer. In those hours, the sanctuary staff slept, unaware that patience itself was learning to take shape inside those boundaries. The sound of his steps became part of the place, a pulse stitched into soil and wind, the first sign that captivity might yet remember the rhythm of freedom.
Spring came with softer air and the hum of insects. Rowan began venturing closer to the open side of his world, drawn by sound rather than sight, the steady rhythm of paperwork turning, a pencil scratching. Grace Porter sat there each morning, cross-legged, quiet, reading reports aloud to herself. She didn't coax or feed, she simply existed near him. For weeks, he pretended not to notice. Then one morning, when her shadow moved against the mesh, his head lifted, his pupils widened, not in fear, but curiosity. The stillness between them grew heavy and familiar. For the first time since the trailer, he didn't retreat. He blinked once, slow and deliberate, and the woman outside the fence kept breathing at his pace. Trust, fragile as dew, began to form, not asked for, only mirrored. The sanctuary learned his routine: night pacing, dawn silence, measured glances at the tree line. Healing came slowly.
The scars on his paws hardened into pale crescents. His fur, once dull, began to catch sunlight in flecks of amber. But the most visible change was in his gaze. The dull resignation had turned to assessment, the look of a creature deciding what to believe in. He no longer hid when footsteps approached, he watched instead, eyes following movement without flinching. That patience, mistaken for submission, was something else entirely. It was calculation. Somewhere beneath the quiet, instinct was rewiring itself around gentleness. Every day he tested a new kind of strength, not in attack, but endurance. The wild, denied expression was finding other ways to move through him.
Then came the sound that changed everything, a cry, small and high-pitched, carried from a crate at the far end of the corridor. A single orphaned bobcat kitten had arrived, no more than 3 weeks old, trembling with hunger. Space was short, and the only available nursery lay beside Rowan's enclosure. Staff hesitated, debating risks, but the decision was made by necessity, not choice. When the cub cried again, Rowan turned toward the sound. His ears twitched, his body still. Through the wire, his gaze fixed on the movement, a tiny blur of fur, helpless and unaware of danger. Hours passed. The kitten slept. Rowan did not. He stayed near the barrier, eyes half closed, humming low frequencies that rolled like distant thunder. For the first time, his silence felt deliberate, protective, not broken. Dawn arrived washed in pale orange. The kitten whimpered, the thin sound of hunger slicing through air. Rowan approached the fence, paws dragging slightly, breath forming clouds. He leaned close, emitting a soft, repetitive trill, the sound wild mothers use to guide their young. The kitten wobbled toward it, unsteady, following instinct it shouldn't yet remember. Across the sanctuary yard, monitors blinked, recording what theory said could not happen. There was no aggression, no dominance, only precision, a ritual unfolding outside the vocabulary of science. Somewhere, Grace stopped mid-step, sensing the shift before she saw it. Two lives, both displaced, had recognized the same language, absence answering absence. That morning, the sanctuary changed from hospital to classroom. The wild had found a new method to heal itself.
From that day forward, patterns emerged. The kitten watched the older cat, imitating stance and stillness. Rowan adjusted his pace to smaller steps, his grooming movements slower, deliberate, teaching without touch. When the kitten stumbled, he waited. When it hid, he waited longer. Patience became instruction. Grace noted each behavior in quiet disbelief, a data sheet filled with miracles written in past tense. The fence between them no longer separated captivity from wildness, it separated two phases of the same resilience. The kitten began to eat on its own, sleep soundly, move with confidence. Every small success echoed the rhythm of Rowan's breathing. For the first time since the mutilation, his existence carried purpose. He wasn't living for himself anymore. He was living for continuation. Seasons turned in quick succession, green to amber to gray. The first kitten grew strong enough for release, vanishing into the hills that once held thunder. More orphans came. Each time, Rowan waited at the fence, patient as stone, repeating the same ritual. His fur thickened with years, his pace slowed, but his eyes grew brighter. Grace learned to measure time not by calendar, but by arrivals and departures, each foster another proof that damage could evolve into devotion. The sanctuary adjusted its routines around him. Cameras were moved, feeding schedules changed, fences expanded. Without intention, the wounded predator had become the quiet heart of the place.
When winter returned, frost tracing patterns across the mesh, the old cat lay beneath the oak, eyes reflecting dawn, as though already expecting the next generation.
Years later, another storm arrived, not as violent, but just as heavy with need. 9 crates again, each trembling with frightened breath. Grace stood in the drizzle, watching the past repeat itself. When the doors opened, the kittens spilled out in chaos, clawing at air and memory. Across the enclosure, Rowan lifted his head. His fur, faded now, caught the light like ash on water. He limped toward the fence, slower than before, but with the same measured calm. The 9 froze, instinct colliding with recognition. No sound, no command, just gravity, the pull of an old teacher reclaiming his classroom. Around them, thunder rolled across the hills like applause. The circle had closed. The wild, once interrupted, was preparing to begin again. Rain fell in silver threads, steady and rhythmic. The kittens learned his tempo quickly. Their play grew quieter, movements cleaner, mistakes fewer. They no longer flinched at thunder, they turned toward it. Rowan's eyes, clouded with age, tracked each one with precision. Grace watched from the shed, camera idle, pen forgotten. Dr. Lang murmured once that the scene looked rehearsed, but it wasn't. It was inheritance, not genetic, but learned through presence. When Rowan shifted, the young followed. When he rested, so did they. The fence had become something sacred, a membrane between eras. The wild was no longer about violence or territory. It was rhythm, patience transferred through time, survival expressed in stillness.
As the weeks passed, patterns deepened. Rowan no longer needed to move much. His lessons existed in the pauses, in the way he waited before eating, the way he turned his back to noise. The kittens mirrored it perfectly, growing lean, alert, efficient. Grace realized they weren't being tamed, they were being reminded of order. In the evenings, light slanted through the enclosure, slicing the air into stripes of gold and shadow. The kittens practiced stalking each line, their bodies in sync with his breathing. Outside, the world kept its distance, unaware that in a quiet corner of Oklahoma, the rules of nature were being rewritten by something wounded, but wiser. The wild wasn't learned through dominance anymore. It was inherited through calm. Age carved its slow map across Rowan's body. His movements grew heavy, but his discipline never faltered. He still patrolled the fence each dawn, ensuring each young cat met his gaze before sunrise. His ribs showed now, fur thinning at the shoulders, but his eyes held the same molten steadiness as the day he silenced the storm. The staff prepared softer bedding, richer food, all the gestures of comfort humans know. He ignored them. His work wasn't done. Even when his joints stiffened, he rose. Even when pain turned steps into effort, he circled the boundary one more time. The kittens watched, mimicking each limp, learning that endurance too is a lesson. Across the sanctuary, wind carried dry leaves into spirals, his final apprentices following the shape of his walk.
The air cooled. The last litter reached strength, sleek fur shining under the pale sun. They would soon leave, return to the forests where his kind belonged. Grace stood by the enclosure, sensing a quiet change she couldn't name. Rowan lay in the grass, eyes half closed, sides moving shallowly. The kittens played nearby, but never strayed far. His breath had become their metronome. Every pause they made echoed his rhythm. Grace understood then. He wasn't teaching survival anymore. He was teaching them how to let go. Each glance toward the hills was rehearsal for absence. each silence between breaths, a transfer of knowledge older than memory. When dusk came, he stirred once more, turning east as if waiting for light that never failed him. At dawn, the sanctuary was still. Mist clung low, blurring fences into soft lines. Rowan didn't rise for food. Grace entered the enclosure slowly, her boots brushing against dew-soaked grass. Beneath the oak, he lay curled, body settled as if mid-rest. Around him were traces of play, feathers, pine cones, small trophies the kittens had left behind. His fur glowed faintly in the half-light, gold threaded with silver. He looked neither captive nor wild, only complete. Grace knelt, one hand pressed to the earth beside him, not to touch, but to feel the quiet weight of purpose fulfilled. The sanctuary, once filled with sound, exhaled into silence. Nature, for a moment, stood still to honor what it had reclaimed through him.
The following week, workers cleared branches, planted new saplings, rebuilt the fence where his shadow once walked. Dana Brooks approved a memorial garden, a small bronze statue beneath the oak. Dr. Lang wrote the inscription himself. He turned captivity into curriculum. Visitors arrived, drawn by curiosity, leaving in reverence. School children walked the path, hearing of the old bobcat who raised what science said he couldn't. They lingered near the statue, tracing its texture, whispering as if afraid to disturb the air. The sanctuary's new season began with no storm, only stillness, the kind that follows understanding. The bronze glinted beneath the same sunlight that once warmed his fur, reflecting not sorrow, but continuity. In every shadow cast by that sculpture, the shape of the teacher remained. Spring returned. Grass pushed through the soil Rowan had once flattened with his steps. The sanctuary expanded, new enclosures built, new rescues arriving. But his presence lingered, not in sound, but in structure. The routines he shaped endured. Feeding schedules timed to patience, handling kept minimal, silence respected as communication. Grace, now senior caretaker, found herself repeating the same quiet methods he'd taught her without words. Sometimes, when dusk colored the hills in amber, she'd stand by the memorial, hearing faint echoes, not of voice, but of rhythm. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a wild bobcat's cry answered. She smiled, realizing the legacy wasn't carved in metal, but moving through the forest, alive and hunting. The teacher's absence had become the lesson.
Months later, Lang reviewed the tracking data of released bobcats. Their movements traced strange circles across the map, all territories intersecting near the sanctuary. Wild animals rarely stayed near humans, yet these did. Their routes orbited the very place their teacher once stood. Lang printed the images and placed them by the memorial. Grace studied the loops, silent, then folded the paper once and set it beneath the bronze paw. The pattern didn't need interpretation. The wild, it seemed, had built its own kind of remembrance, geography as devotion. What had started in confinement now defined the landscape itself. Purpose had left its coordinates on the world. Morning fog curled low across Thunder Ridge, turning the sanctuary to a watercolor of silver and green. The statue gleamed, sunlight breaking through clouds in quiet fragments. Near its base, a single paw print marked the damp soil. Fresh, small, perfectly shaped. Grace noticed it only when she turned to leave. She didn't search for its maker. Some evidence isn't meant to be verified. She simply watched as mist drifted past the bronze, as if carrying an unseen presence through the air. From somewhere deep in the hills, a faint chirp echoed, the same note that once silenced storms. It lingered, soft and certain, then faded into the wind. The sanctuary held its breath again, not in grief this time, but in gratitude. The wild had remembered its teacher.